So today we're going to talk about vertical translations, in other words, a shift up or down. And what I want you to realize is that it can kind of be written in two different formats. Kind of depends on the textbook that you're looking at or the resource that you're looking at. In some instances, they have the trig function and then they add the vertical translation to the end. But if you notice on this particular worksheet and on other resources, it's added at the beginning. And it's just to kind of help you really highlight on that and notice, okay, I have to make this shift. There are a couple of different ways to kind of think through these problems. So I will explain both ways just to kind of help for those of you who may feel like it's helpful to get multiple explanations, just to try to help with figuring out how they go. So let's take a look at what happens with let's take a look at how this vertical shift gets dealt with. So I want you to think about the fact that on this first graph, it's a basic cosine graph, only what this is telling us is that it is just getting shifted down one place. So 1 unit down, but then we're going to draw the same graph. So the first way of thinking about graphing these is by basically changing where your midline or your main axis is. And so whatever the shift is, the vertical translation is, you're going to draw your midline, you're going to draw just kind of a line there to help you realize, okay, I'm going to draw my graph from this particular location now rather than the original x-axis, y-axis. So in other words, we've shifted down one already. So I'm going to draw from this particular axis, and that's where I'm going to draw my points that I know for my graph. So once I have shifted and done that shift, now I'm just drawing the cosine graph, which I know means that I start up 1 from that location. At pi over 2, I go to the 1 below it. At pi, I go down again. At 3 pi over 2, I go back up. And then at 2 pi, I go back up to the beginning. So that is one way to kind of think through the process. So that is just shifting or changing your midline, is what I refer to that as. Okay, so that is one way to think about it. A more mathematical way of thinking about it, for those of you who prefer a more mathematical way, if you think about what your y values are at each of the values, so we have our x values of 0 and pi over 2 and pi and 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. And from that, we have our corresponding y values, which in this case, if it's a cosine, are 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. And so some people have just memorized that cosine is 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. Now, this shift that we are doing, this subtraction of 1 or shifting down 1, just tells us that from there, if we take these particular y values and we can subtract 1 from each of these, and then that gives us our new y values that we will graph. Now, we end up graphing the same points as we did before, doing the shift of the midline, but it's just a little bit different way of thinking about it, and it shows some actual math or computation that some people like and prefer to do. So the shift of down 1 means we subtract 1 from each of the y values, and then that's where we graph each of those points. And voila, we have our y equals -1 plus cosine x graph. All right, let's look at another example. And so for this one, if you notice, once again, it's a negative sign graph. So I'm going to do the second method that I showed over there first. So our x values are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And our corresponding y values for a negative sign graph are 0, -1, 0, pi. positive 1, 0. So those are our y values for the basic graph. But now what this is telling us is that we are going to shift these points up 2. So I'm going to add 2 to each of these y values. And if I do that, I get 2, 1, 2, 3, 2. So that's telling me at 0, I'm going to graph at 2. At pi over 2, I'm at 1. At pi, I'm at 2. At 3 pi over 2, I'm up at 3. And then at 2 pi, again, I am at 2. So that gives me my curve. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way is by drawing that midline. And what that would do, how that would look, is we think about our midline. So our midline would be at positive 2. And then from this new midline, if we draw a negative sign graph, that means from here we would go down 1 and then back up 1 and up 1 again and then back to the midline. And that is how we would draw our curve. So either way, you're going to get the same graph. It's just a little bit different way of thinking about it. Okay? All right, so I want you to think about the fact that in some instances you may have an amplitude change along with that vertical shift. And in this case, we also have a period change. So we've got everything included on this one. So we're going to work through this one a little bit more carefully. So first thing I'm going to do is think about what my new period would be. So 2 pi over 2 tells me that my period is pi. And so this would be at pi. So this is at pi over 2, pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4. In terms of my y-axis, I'm gonna, just for space sake, I'm gonna draw this one as a midline shift to help you see this a little bit clearer, and because of how much space I need for this graph. So my x-axis, I'm actually going to label as that -3 and think of that as my midline. Here's -2, -1, so here's 0. And it's because I know how far high and how low we have to go on this graph that I'm actually doing this. So we want to think, if you're gonna use your midline at this point, you have to be careful because from your midline you are drawing a graph of -4 cosine. So that means you are starting 4 units down. So you would start here and then go up. And I didn't go up high enough on this direction, did I? So I would start 4 down from my midline, then go to my midline. At pi over 2, at this next point, I'm going all the way up 4, and then back to my midline, and then back down to below. And there's the shape of that one. Mathematically, I think a lot of people prefer to think about this one using the math. I'm just going to write the y's. And to begin with, remember the basic y cosine graph is 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. But then we're multiplying everything by -4. So that means we have -4, 0, +4, 0, -4. So that's my new y's. But now I have my shift. So now from here, if you're doing this mathematically, now we need to subtract 3 from each of these points. And that gives me my -7, -3, 1, -3, -7, which is the points that I graphed, but it just came about them a little bit different thought process. One last one here before you get to try some. So this is a 4 plus 2 sine x. If you notice, I've already written in the x-axis markers. And I want to do the mathematical way of dealing with this first. So for a 2 sine x, we would have 0, 2, 0, -2, 0. But then this plus 4 means I'm adding 4 to each of these y values. So that puts me at 4, 6, 4, 2, 4. So once again, because of space, it's going to actually be easier. I don't want to have to go too far off of this graph. So instead, I'm gonna make my axis here, my midline, at 4, and I'll go up by 2s just to give it a little bit more space. So at 0, we're going to be at 4. I'm going to draw this in a different color to kind of make it stand out. At pi over 2, we'll be at 6. At pi, we'll be at 4 again. So I'm just drawing, at this point, I'm just drawing my 2 sine x, or I'm following these points, whichever way you prefer. At 3 pi over 2, we're at 2. And at 2 pi, we are at 4 again, or my midline. And there's my curve. I hope this helps. If you need some other examples of this, I will probably do another page where I just show a couple other examples if you feel like you want or need to kind of think through or process the information a little bit more.